And this Hangout is now live. Welcome to Virtually Connecting at ELI 2017 in sunny and warm Houston, I think. Joe?
Not so much sunny, but yes, much warmer than you've got it in Ontario.
Absolutely. So just introduce yourselves there, and then we'll introduce the people who have joined us today.
So, I'm Joe Murphy. I'm the director of the Center for Innovative Pedagogy at Kenyon College, and I'm our ELI roving correspondent.
I'm Flower Darby. I'm an instructional designer at Northern Arizona University and faculty as well, and I'm here today to discuss emotional and personal presence in our online components.
And I'm Nate Angel. I work for the nonprofit Hypothesis that supports open annotation across the entire web.
And I am John Doherty. I'm the instructional design manager at Northern Arizona University. And it's actually raining and very cold right now outside. It feels almost like a British morning out there. And I'm also here with Flower to discuss emotional and personal presence in online courses.
Thank you. And now why don't we start with Anna and then Chuck.
Right, hi, I'm Anna Christina and I teach online, and I'm very interested in exploring more about connecting emotionally with students in virtual learning environments.
Chuck Pearson, Associate Professor of Natural Science at Tusculum College in Greenville, Tennessee. I'll have things to throw in at random on we go.
Okay, why don't we then get Kayla and Trina.
Hi, I'm Kayla Collins. I am an occupational therapy practitioner and a faculty member at the University of St. Augustine in St. Augustine, Florida. And my current dissertation is on instructor social presence, and I've been coming across a lot of emotional presence literature, so I wanted to learn more about that.
And I'm Trina Marmarelli. I'm Director of Instructional Technology at Reed College in surprisingly beautiful and sunny Portland, Oregon this morning. It's a small liberal arts college, so we do a lot of emotional connecting in the classroom, but I'm wondering how we can also do a better job of doing that in our various electronic learning environments.
Thank you. And I'm Helen DeWard. I teach with the Faculty of Education here in Central Ontario, and we had a good dumping of snow, so I had some shoveling to do this morning, and it's snowing again. So let's take it away because I'm looking forward to a little bit of sunshine conversation. Joe, would you like to just talk about ELI and the settings there first, and then we'll get into the...
So ELI is the Teaching and Learning Center, Teaching and Learning Centered conference held by EDUCAUSE. So the fall EDUCAUSE meeting is this gargantuan cast of thousands meeting, and it looks at the entirety of IT support within higher education primarily. And one of the reasons that I prefer this conference is it's much smaller. You see the same people. It's about a 700-person conference, I think. They haven't actually had the opening keynote, so I don't know what the actual number is. But it's something where we're going to see the same people over and over, and we're not going to have to worry about accidentally getting in a big iron conversation, but everything's going to be focused on teaching and learning with our students. And a lot of what we're doing, some of my personal interest in this is that I was just telling Flower, we've got a reading group convened right now that's looking at reflective and contemplative pedagogies, and a lot of those include aspects of how we are emotional in relationship to each other, how we make that kind of connection. So I'm here to get a preview of what Flower is going to talk about in the session.
Awesome, thank you, Flower, and then maybe John, you can join into the conversation and talk about what you're doing.
May I invite John to start, actually?
Sure.
Because really this was his proposal in the first place, and I tagged along, so I'd like to let him open us up.
Well, I think Kayla, I hope I got that name right. Cool. You were talking about you're doing your dissertation on social presence, and I think Flower and I and Kristen have been kind of including emotional presence in our courses without really knowing that that's what we were doing. And we kind of happened across some blog, I think it was either Terry Anderson or Randy Garrison, I forget which one actually blogged this, that was talking about a lot of feedback he's getting on the community of inquiry model and the fact that maybe it's missing emotional presence. And as he put it, he said, yeah, 3 white cowboys in central Alberta in Canada, there's no way we're putting emotion in our courses. And here's kind of, I started thinking, well, you know, we kind of do that. And I kind of started thinking about the practices that I do in my courses. I teach pretty intense subjects, and I know Flower and Chris do as well. I teach courses on terrorism. And I teach courses that are harking back in some ways to even my own past and where I grew up in Northern Ireland. And I initially was teaching around ideas of that you might get from books, and then realizing that the students were giving me really good feedback when I was actually talking about personal experience. And so I decided to go dig for stories. And when you actually have stories that are really in your face, like some of the stories I chose, and can provoke a very strong emotional reaction, I saw that the students were getting a lot more engaged in what we were doing. And so I began to do that with some of the other areas, and Flower will talk and demonstrate tomorrow. Even when I'm teaching a first-year course and where I bring in poetry in my very first day. And I'm starting to get to a point in my life where I believe poetry shouldn't be read, it should be heard. And I had this poem that we would read first day of class that was talking about the poet coming home and watching his father dig potatoes or dig rills to plant potatoes, and remembering his grandfather digging to bring back to the home fires. And I could read it. Yeah, it was okay. Not a great reader of poetry. We could read it as a class. Never really caught what was going on in there. And then suddenly I let the writer himself read it. And the connections that we were making through just an audiobook kind of suggested to me there might be places that we can bring these emotional connections through technology into what we do. Is that fair, Flower? Do you want to add?
Right, that certainly was John's original idea, and then we began to explore ways in which we do this through story, through song, and then sometimes, because John and I both are in the more humanities area, we began to think about how do you do this in other fields that you might not have that literature or that experience. And so some of the things that we began to think about was how can we harness technology to invite experts in the field, for example, industry leaders, to come into our classes using video conferencing or perhaps video recording. And again, it's really the idea that even putting a face and a voice to the content just makes the experience so much more meaningful to our students. They can relate and connect. Joe here just a few minutes ago was talking about lectures with professors who their hair isn't perfect and how that just makes them much more real and authentic, and then we can relate. And so really the concept that John and I came up with was when we immerse ourselves in the experience of others, how do we therefore craft a deeper understanding and plain and simply more engagement, more interesting than reading words on a page? How can we capture our students? And John and I both teach online and in person, and this can be done in various contexts, but specifically for the online setting, you know, they can't, as we all know, online classes, you have to intentionally develop presence that is more social and more emotional in practice. And so how can we do that? And what are ways that we're already doing it, as John said, that we hadn't really articulated before?
I think it's interesting that you're looking both at the issue of emotional, I mean, it sounds like you're looking at the issue of the emotional presence of the teacher and students, but also the emotional presence of the other kind of that third group of people in the class, the authors or scholars, the emotional presence of of this thing that's often abstracted out to content, but that was made by a person for a reason. And that's a really neat idea.
Definitely. I think one of the first real experiences where I saw my class come alive was when I had one of my authors who was on his book tour here in the United States. I was connecting with him online, and I was chatting, and I said, hey, you wouldn't happen to be anywhere near Arizona in September? And he said, yeah, I'm going to a Van Halen concert on Monday this day. I said, well, why don't I come down and get you on Tuesday morning and bring you back to Flagstaff, and you can meet with my students. And this was September 2015. We've actually even taped an interview with him that I could then use for future students. And in comes this writer from Belfast. He's talking about a story in which he has a very antagonistic main character who is himself a killer, and who we follow him as he kills more people. And he's telling a story of the peace process in Northern Ireland through this character. And yeah, we can read the story, we can kind of get a sense of that, but then when Stuart himself came into the classroom and he connected his story to his watching of the Batman movies, The Dark Knight and such, and then some of these, he had a very strong connection to American thrillers and American road fiction. The students just walked away. First of all, they heard his voice, heard him speaking with a very strong Belfast accent, and then heard him read excerpts, put the voice of Jerry Fagan, his main character, in front of them in a way that it should be heard, and then connected to their popular culture and demonstrate to them that this late 40-something Irish author actually understood who they were, and they not only just loved connecting with the author, but they connected with the story that much better at that point. And then obviously from there really connected to where I wanted to take the class. I sent them to find other stories that people who live with terrorism tell. And I said, so we use Northern Ireland as a case study, and hopefully peace lasts in Northern Ireland longer than the 20 years it's been lasting. But then I said, go find more. Go find contemporary ones. And they were bringing back a pianist who wheeled a piano into Maidan Square in Ukraine. And the fires and everything were going on around him during the big protests. And there he was sitting playing music. And they were able to bring that voice that my intent was, you tell me the story of the people that lived through these events, as opposed to actually tell me what the New York Times says is the story of people living through these events. Find the real voice. And by finding that real voice, I think they made that connection to those stories a heck of a lot better, I think, than textbooks could have ever done.
Wow. So connecting poetry and story to really real life events and issues and weighty topics, it builds that emotional connection for your students. That's really quite impressive, incredible.
I think it's them hearing those stories from the people who are making the stories. So even something like what Flower's talking about, where she's bringing in experts in the field, where we do that generally in classes. Sometimes anyway, we bring in our guest lecturers. How do we capture them and maintain them, bring them into online environments? Like Flower was able to capture an extremely busy chief information officer in a course on educational technology at a time where he was, basically beginning a brand new role as the CIO. And think about that, and think about the stories that that someone like that could be telling to somebody who themselves is facing the prospects of becoming an information officer or a tech person in education.
How do you deal with some of the emotional issues that come out from your students, if they're really connecting to these people and these events, how do you then, I don't know, deconstruct it for them? How do you know who's going to react?
We kind of did together. That's a very good question. I thought I was doing a good thing in my terrorism course by concluding my course using a BBC television serial called The Fall. And I think it's on Netflix. It's a really good TV show, by the way. And I connected with the author. I talked to her a little bit, and then we put the show on in the last 2 weeks of the course. First episode, by the end of the first episode, I had a student emailing me and saying, I cannot watch any more of this. She herself was diagnosed as a survivor of abuse, and this was the story of a sexual predator and the police officer who was trying to catch him. And I thought, oh God, no, I didn't even think of that. But when we kind of deal with things like that, even something as simple as a movie that I use in my face-to-face course called Good Vibrations, story of a Belfast music store owner, and he became the godfather of punk rock in Belfast. But throughout the movie, it's a very typical in-your-face, on-the-streets type story, because he swears a lot. Now, every other word an Irishman says is a swear word, and you do that in a classroom in Arizona with 18 and 19-year-olds, and the F word comes out every other phrase or something. It can be challenging, and so we actually use that as an opportunity to talk about difference. Is this really, the way he's using this word, a swear word? Can we talk about these scenes in ways that you're having this emotional reaction to it? Let's break that down together. Sometimes privately between me and the student, a lot of times too in small groups or large groups, we talk about these issues. But the biggest issue of all is you can't throw that at them in the very first class, because there needs to be trust. They need to be trusting of each other, even online, I suspect. They have to trust each other enough to have an emotional reaction, because for many of us, we don't think emotion belongs in a classroom.
I'd like to jump in and just expand that idea in terms of creating space for processing our emotions. I do like what John just said about this crazy idea that emotions impact learning and learning might impact emotions. This is essentially the gist of the idea of adding emotional presence into the community of inquiry, is that it exists and we should acknowledge it and then be intentional about how we want to harness and really, again, the affordances of technology, but also how we learn more significantly when there is an emotional connection. Creating that space to explore the emotions can be done in the online classroom simply by way of having a journal, a reflective journal of some kind, perhaps throwing out some provocative prompts. We have an example, Chris, that John has been referring to. She's sort of joined our presentation at a later date, but she explains how in her classes, she just throws out discussion prompts that may initially seem frivolous or trivial, but really, for example, she teaches a class on gaming and also on Doctor Who, and one of her online discussion prompts is, if you could have any superpower in the world, what would you choose and what would you do with it? And that seems like a fun way to engage students, but what she's really beginning to expose them to is ideas of power and ethics. And then that can lead to, again, more deep and meaningful discussions. And so whether, as John said, you need to build that trust and you don't jump in at the deep end perhaps on day one, whether it's an online or face-to-face, but then allowing that space to explore in a safe way, and yet testing the boundaries. We need to encourage students to do that as well. It's a fun and interesting balance to strive for.
Can I ask a question? So you were talking about the emotional presence being added to the community of inquiry. How do you extract that from the social presence? Where do you see the delineation between the two?
Well, I actually see it's not exclusive to the social presence, because of the way we've been talking is I think where we're going is it's embedded in all three of the community of inquiry. So the teacher presence, the cognitive presence, the social presence. When you are bringing all of those together, for example, with a poem that I used my first day of my first year class. The poem itself is so resonant with emotion. That then speaks to some emotions that maybe in a first day, first term, first year student is going through. That speaks also then to maybe some of the nervousness and emotions that the teacher themselves are bringing into the classroom. So when all three of those are blended together, I think that's where you kind of begin to see that emotional presence. I'm not sure that we are in agreement that with some of the arguments that it's a whole dimension in and of itself, or a whole new component, or a whole new presence. It's actually a meta presence. It's in everything. Would you agree, Flower?
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. In fact, if you were to Google emotional presence and community of inquiry, you'll see that a common visual representation is to have a fourth circle in the Venn diagram. But we conceived it, and in our presentation slides, we have emotional presence encircling the entire three, the original three in the Venn diagram. Because again, there's so many angles and aspects, what are the teacher's emotions? What are the students' emotions? We can get into universal design of learning in terms of what emotions are students bringing into that learning environment, and acknowledging that and trying to design intentionally for that. There's just a lot of different ways to approach this idea. And that's why we didn't want to separate it. We say it's there. Let's be intentional about recognizing it, asking questions, planning for it, anticipating. I think we've all had some experiences where a student reacted in a way that we were not expecting. In my particular case, early on in my teaching career, I don't know how I justified this, but I used to show Fight Club. And there's a very violent scene that resonated with a student who lost her dad to suicide. And this, again, was something that I just had not anticipated. So trying to anticipate and yet also allowing ourselves to be on that precipice of pushing the boundary, challenging mindsets and expectations, and yet being sensitive and allowing the space to explore and debrief. That's where we're kind of coming from. And again, how do we use technologies, deliberately to do those things?
I'm curious, I recently learned that Flower is a dance teacher. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me okay. Am I close enough to the mic? Okay. So I'm curious, you talked about bringing voice into learning. What about movement and kind of more the body?
Right, that's a great question. Yes, I've had a sort of a dual track career of teaching and choreographing dance and English. It's always been my twin interest ever since I was a child. I'm very interested in the psychomotor domain.
Psychomotor, sorry, I didn't know the right word.
That's okay, that's okay.
Now we do.
And sometimes I joke with my students, I haven't actually done this, but I joke with my students that they're going to need to come up with an interpretive dance to represent a concept. So maybe that's an idea for next fall. I will say that probably the most powerful dance piece that I ever choreographed came out of a very dark period of the dark night of the soul kind of thing. And in that way, I very explicitly used movement to explore and express my own emotions from that period of my life. But how do we bring that into the classroom or into the online space? That's a great question.
Two things. One, I had a message from Maha, who's following along with us online, specifically to say, Flower, Maha wishes that she had your name.
Thank you. It's a great conversation piece.
It's a wonderful conversation piece. Apparently, it's common in Arabic in that way. I'm hearing what you're saying about connecting with student experience. and how that informs learning. And that's not something that's entirely unfamiliar to us in the sciences, even because when you're actually going and doing learning within the sciences, you're working in the lab, you're working tactile experience, visual experience, and how you communicate that experience. It's one thing to do that type of teaching in a very algorithmic, very formal fashion, very fact-driven, but so much of what makes the understanding in the sciences real to students is actually seeing the thing happen. And I really owe a debt to Brittany Brown O'Donnell at Virginia Tech for this particular thought. Seeing the thing happen and then building a narrative of that observation, how you tell the story of what you observed in that experience in the laboratory. So so I'm part of my business here is finding ways that you wonderful people in the humanities are saying things that might be applicable to us who do physical science weirdness. And that's part of where I'm building a connection here is in the narrative of student observation. There's a question in there somewhere. I don't even know if I said it.
Well, I think the word you use, story, that's where I continually keep coming back to is what's the story? And I didn't realize I was kind of doing history until somebody told me I was doing history. Because they were walking away from a couple of my courses saying, I know so much more about the Troubles in Northern Ireland than when I first came here. In some ways, I know about the Troubles in Northern Ireland because I hadn't got a clue what it was before I even started. But I thought I was teaching novels. And then I realized that
I'm right there alongside. When I'm teaching physical science to non-majors, part of what helps build their understanding is, that all these gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, we actually had to discover those were unique things. How did we discover those were unique things? You wind up telling the story of Joseph Black and his encounter with identifying their uniqueness. You wind up being a historian rather than a scientist. It's still important stuff.
Kind of almost you're telling a mystery story.
Right.
You're going back and you're digging into the story of science. I think I remember reading, I think it was in The Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan, how he was kind of somewhat dismissed by his peers because he was more of a communicator than a scientist. He told science stories, the billions and billions and Spaceship Earth and things like that. And people who have come to science through just his storytelling alone, I think it's very, very. We've been telling stories for 40,000 years, so we must be doing something right.
And it also occurs to me that understanding the student's story of motivation is very important in every field, but in the natural sciences as well. And this comes out of a conversation we were just having at Kenyon relating to digital storytelling about the sciences. And the number of our students who are pursuing pre-med or similar degrees, and at the core of that somewhere there's an I'm going to find a cure for grandma story. Or, I am motivated to study this because of some deep emotional thing. And in a way that needs to be unpacked because it's not always the healthiest choice the student has made. But sometimes it's a very good choice. So, it is something that needs space, and maybe that's not a classroom experience, maybe that's an advising experience, maybe it is a classroom experience. But, I think that's another interesting aspect of figuring out what the story is that brought us all into this classroom.
Right.
And coming from a health field, I'm thinking about what you were asking about the psychomotor components of it, and that we always seem to hear students say that they understand and learn so much better when they have done it on a real client. But I'm thinking as we're talking that that's because they're connecting those emotions with the real client who's telling them their story at the same time. Because as we reflect on those experiences in the field, it always comes back to that patient's story and what they said about their life and their experience with OT. But when we're having the students practice on each other, maybe we need to be asking more questions about their emotional experience during the lab practice, where they don't have that same person reinforcing these emotions on them, and just having them make more of that connection rather than just practice the skill, but make them those emotions.
Kayla, if I could, NAU has a recently developed Doctor of Occupational Therapy program. It's pretty new. And I was asked, I was involved, John was also involved to some extent in building the program and supporting the faculty. And then they asked me if I would please come in and talk to the students about how important it is to do their homework, basically. The whole program is blended, and they asked me if I would please come in and talk to the students about those kinds of expectations. It happened that about 10 days prior to the date that we had scheduled, my mom had a brain bleed, and she ended up with stroke-like damage. And in my presentation to the students, I deliberately brought my mom into it, and I put up a picture on the slides, and I said, I want you to know this stuff because you're going to be working with my mom, and I want you to be able to help her. And I want you to remember what you need to know. And it was very raw to me. In fact, I got pretty emotional in the moment, but those students, I think, had a very impactful experience about why it's important to truly know the content and not just sort of try to learn it to pass a test. So
yeah, and the day-to-day of the classroom, I think they forget that because they get wrapped up in the schedule and what's going on and what they have to do and when the practical is going to be. And so I like what you said about having it incorporated into all areas of the community of inquiry, because that's our job as the instructor, to continuously bring it back to that emotion at different places, to keep them focused on the why and how they're feeling about it and how this impacts other people, and take them back to that first day where we asked what brought you to OT school, and they have those my grandmother stories, and get them back there. Thank you.
So I'm conscious of the time. Are there words of wisdom for those who haven't considered the emotional component of courses, and drawing on specific stories, poetry? If an instructor is just about to venture into this, do you have some words of caution or words of inspiration that, from your experience?
Maybe a word of wisdom is trust your own emotions. So trust your gut. If you think it's going to go well, it probably won't actually, but give it a shot. And don't be afraid to, because emotion kind of falls into all three of the dimensions of the community of inquiry, don't be afraid to let your own show as well, to make that emotional connection. And I think if you're showing and you're showing the presence of emotion in your courses and with your students, they are more likely, I think, to maybe share a little bit more of their own as well. But also be very, be afraid. That's a good emotion to bring in, because it's never going to go as predicted.
I would add to that, and I think we've already said this, but just to make it more explicit, that you do want to be intentional in how you structure the exploration of emotions. And perhaps on day one is not the day that you jump in to the really high impact or risky kind of scenario. But again, intentionally looking to build trust, even in the online environment, you could certainly do that. And then begin with perhaps more safe explorations that then lead to something that might be more heated or intense as the course develops. Just being intentional about that planning process, I think, can make a big difference.
Thank you so much. Are there any people here in the room that haven't had a chance to speak, would like to ask a question or make a comment? allowing time for silence. Sometimes
Just thinking this is the holding silence part that we were just talking about.
Silence has a place in the teaching space. So we'll let you go, Joe. I know that you've got a full day and you've got lots of other activities happening at the ELI site today. We thank you very much, Flower and John, for bringing the conversation to the digital spaces this way with Virtually Connecting. Really appreciate you taking the time today to do that, and look forward to hearing more about your work as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The rest in the room can stay and hang out a little bit more. We can talk a little bit more about how this conversation connects to your own space before we sign off. Thank you.
We'll wait for the live button to go off.